The morning air tasted like copper and ash when Zelda Patterson woke to find her entire world reduced to splinters, and memories scattered across the Nevada desert like discarded playing cards. She opened her eyes to an impossible sky where her bedroom ceiling should have been, her body wedged beneath what remained of her iron bed frame, the only thing that had kept the collapsing walls from crushing her completely when the tornado had torn through Las Vegas in the pre-dawn darkness of May 15th, 1883. Her ears still rang with the freight train roar that had yanked her from sleep just seconds before her modest homestead exploded around her. And now she lay perfectly still, afraid that moving might reveal injuries her shock-numbed body was hiding from her consciousness. The silence after the storm felt obscene. Zelda pushed against the twisted metal above her, her calico nightgown catching on jagged edges as she crawled free from the wreckage. Her hands were bleeding from a dozen small cuts she did not remember receiving, and her dark hair had come loose from its braid, whipping across her face in the pre-dawn wind that still carried the tornado's ghost. She stood on shaking legs and turned in a slow circle, her breath catching in her throat at the devastation. The house her father had built before consumption took him 2 years ago was simply gone. Not damaged, not repairable, but erased as thoroughly as if it had never existed. Pieces of her life decorated the landscape for what looked like miles. A blue curtain her mother had sewn before the fever claimed her hung from a Joshua tree 100 yards away. The kitchen table, the one she had eaten breakfast at every morning for 23 years, was nowhere to be seen. Zelda's knees buckled, and she sat down hard on a chunk of foundation stone, the only part of the house still in its original position. The sun was beginning to paint the eastern sky in shades of amber and rose, illuminating the destruction with terrible clarity. Her chicken coop had vanished, taking her 6 laying hens with it. The small barn where she kept her milk cow and the aging mare her father had loved was a skeleton of broken beams. She could see the cow standing in the open desert, apparently unharmed but looking as bewildered as Zelda felt. The mare was lying on her side 30 feet away, and Zelda knew without checking that the animal was dead. The shock was beginning to wear off, replaced by a crushing sense of loss that made it hard to breathe. She had nothing. The tornado had taken everything except the torn nightgown she wore in her life, which suddenly seemed like a cruel joke rather than a blessing. What was she supposed to do now? She had $47 in the Wells Fargo bank in town, assuming the tornado had spared the bank building. She had no family, no close friends, no skills beyond keeping house and tending her small garden. The garden was gone too, she realized, looking at the churned earth where neat rows of beans and squash had been thriving just hours ago. Hello, the homestead. The voice came from behind her, masculine and concerned, and Zelda scrambled to her feet with a gasp. She spun around to see a man on horseback approaching from the direction of town, leading a second horse behind him. Even in her dazed state, she registered that he was tall in the saddle, broad-shouldered, with dark hair visible beneath his wide-brimmed hat. He raised one hand in a peaceful gesture as he drew closer, and she saw his eyes widen as he took in the destruction and her appearance. "Madam, are you hurt?" He dismounted before his horse had fully stopped, dropping both sets of reins and striding toward her. His boots crunched on debris that had been her life. "I saw the damage from the road and came to check for survivors. Lord have mercy, there's nothing left standing." Zelda opened her mouth to respond, but no sound came out. She tried again and managed a whisper. "I am alive. You need a doctor." He shrugged out of his duster as he spoke, revealing a chambray shirt and leather vest. He draped the coat around her shoulders, and only then did Zelda realize she was shivering despite the warming morning air. The coat smelled like sage and leather and tobacco, comforting in its solid realness. "My name is Fletcher Emerson. I own the ranch about 3 miles south of here. Can you walk? We need to get you to town, get those cuts looked at, make sure nothing's broken." "I can walk." Her voice was steadier now. "I am Zelda Patterson. This was my home." Something in his expression softened. "I am sorry for your loss, Miss Patterson, but I am mighty glad you survived. I have seen what tornadoes can do to people, and you standing here is nothing short of miraculous." Fletcher Emerson guided her to the spare horse with a gentle hand at her elbow, and Zelda found herself grateful for his solid presence. He helped her mount, not commenting on her improper attire or bare feet, then swung onto his own horse with practiced ease. As they began the 3-mile ride into Las Vegas, Zelda looked back once at the destruction that had been her home. The rising sun caught on something metal in the debris field, winking at her like a malicious eye. She turned her face forward and did not look back again. The town had not been spared. The tornado had cut a path of destruction through the eastern edge of Las Vegas, taking out a dozen buildings including the Methodist Church and the Mercantile. People were already in the streets, calling for loved ones, digging through rubble, standing in shocked clusters surveying the damage. Fletcher steered their horses toward the doctor's office, which had escaped destruction by virtue of being on the western side of town. He helped Zelda dismount and kept his hand on her arm as they climbed the steps to Dr. Morrison's office, as if he feared she might collapse without his support. He was probably right. Dr. Morrison was a gruff man in his 60s who had treated Zelda's father in his final illness. He took one look at her and ushered her into his examination room, shooing Fletcher out with instructions to wait in the front room. The examination revealed that Zelda's injuries were superficial, despite looking dramatic. Cuts and bruises, minor abrasions, nothing broken or permanently damaged. Her body had survived intact even if her life had not. "You are a lucky young woman," Dr. Morrison said as he bandaged her hands. "The Lord was watching over you this morning." Zelda did not feel lucky, but she nodded and thanked him. When she emerged from the examination room, Fletcher Emerson was still waiting, his hat in his hands, turning it by the brim in a gesture that suggested nervous energy. He looked up when she entered and got to his feet immediately. "Doc says you will be fine with rest and time to heal," Dr. Morrison announced, following her out. "But she needs somewhere to stay. Her place is a total loss from what Emerson here tells me." "She can stay at my ranch," Fletcher said immediately, then seemed to realize how that sounded and added quickly, "I have a housekeeper, Mrs. Chen. She is a proper chaperone and can look after Miss Patterson until she figures out what she wants to do next." "Doctor." Morrison nodded approval, but Zelda felt she needed to protest. "I cannot impose on strangers, Mr. Emerson. I will find a room at the boarding house." "The boarding house lost its roof," Fletcher said gently. "Half the town is homeless right now, Miss Patterson. My ranch was untouched. I have room, and Mrs. Chen would welcome the company. Please. It is the least I can do." Zelda wanted to argue further, but exhaustion was crashing over her in waves, and the practical part of her mind acknowledged that she had limited options. She nodded slowly, and Fletcher's shoulders relaxed slightly, as if he had been genuinely worried she would refuse. They rode out to his ranch in silence, and Zelda found herself studying her unexpected benefactor from the corner of her eye. Fletcher Emerson looked to be in his late 20s, weathered by sun and wind in the way of men who spent their lives outdoors. He had strong features, a straight nose, and a jaw that suggested stubbornness. His hands on the reins were competent and scarred from work, the hands of a man who did not shy away from hard labor. He caught her looking once and offered a small smile that did not quite reach his eyes, and Zelda realized he was probably as uncomfortable with this situation as she was. The Emerson Ranch was larger than Zelda had expected. A sprawling operation with a main house, bunkhouse, barn, and several outbuildings, all built from solid timber that had clearly withstood the tornado without trouble. The house itself was 2 stories, painted white with green shutters, surrounded by a porch that wrapped around 3 sides. It looked like a house built to last, built with care and intention, and Zelda felt a sharp pang of loss for her own home that would never exist again. Mrs. Chen turned out to be a tiny Chinese woman with steel gray hair pulled back in a tight bun, and shrewd dark eyes that took in Zelda's appearance in a single glance. She spoke English with a heavy accent but perfect clarity, and within minutes had Zelda upstairs in a guest bedroom, promising hot water for a bath and clean clothes that had belonged to Fletcher's late mother. Zelda wanted to ask about that, about the sadness she had glimpsed in Fletcher's face when Mrs. Chen mentioned his mother, but exhaustion won. She bathed, dressed in a borrowed calico dress that was slightly too big, and fell into the guest bed, asleep before her head fully settled on the pillow. She woke to afternoon sunlight slanting through lace curtains and the smell of cooking meat drifting up from downstairs. For a moment, she could not remember where she was or why, and then the events of the morning crashed back with nauseating force. Her house was gone. Everything was gone. She was accepting charity from a stranger because she literally had nowhere else to go. Zelda sat up slowly, her body stiff and sore, and pressed her bandaged hands against her face. She would not cry. Crying accomplished nothing. She needed to think, to plan, to figure out what came next. A soft knock on the door interrupted her spiraling thoughts. "Miss Patterson, are you awake?" Mrs. Chen's voice was gentle. "Dinner will be ready soon. Fletcher asks if you will join him, but if you need more rest, I can bring a tray up." Zelda cleared her throat. "I will come down, thank you." She found Fletcher in the dining room, freshly washed and changed into a clean shirt, his dark hair still damp. He stood when she entered, pulling out a chair for her with old-fashioned courtesy that reminded her of her father. Mrs. Chen served beef stew with fresh bread, and Zelda discovered she was ravenous despite the emotional turmoil. They ate in awkward silence for several minutes before Fletcher cleared his throat. "I rode back out to your place this afternoon," he said. "I was hoping to salvage some of your belongings, but Miss Patterson, there is not much left. I did find this, though." He reached into his shirt pocket and pulled out a small leather-bound book. "I think it might be a diary or journal. It was under what was left of your bed frame." Zelda took the book with shaking hands. It was her mother's journal, the one she had written in during the final year of her life. Zelda had read it so many times she had whole passages memorized, but she had thought it lost forever. Tears spilled down her cheeks before she could stop them, and she clutched the journal to her chest like a lifeline. "Thank you," she whispered. "You have no idea what this means to me." Fletcher looked uncomfortable with her tears, but also pleased that he had brought her something of value. "I also found a few other things. Some silver spoons that I think survived, part of a quilt. I loaded everything I could find into my wagon. It is not much, but it is yours." The kindness of this stranger, this man who owed her nothing, broke something loose in Zelda's chest. She cried in earnest then, great heaving sobs that she had been holding back all day, and Fletcher looked panicked for a moment before Mrs. Chen appeared with a handkerchief and shooed him away with rapid Chinese that Zelda suspected were instructions to give her privacy. But Zelda found herself shaking her head. "Please stay," she managed between sobs. "I am sorry for falling apart in your dining room, but please do not leave on my account. Fletcher sat back down slowly, looking like he would rather face down a stampede than a crying woman, but he stayed. He stayed while she cried, while Mrs. Chen patted her shoulder and made comforting sounds, while the candles burned lower and the food grew cold. When Zelda finally regained control of herself, wiping her eyes with the soggy handkerchief, Fletcher was still there, his expression a mixture of concern and something else she could not quite identify. "I am sorry," Zelda said again. "I do not normally cry in front of strangers." "We are not strangers anymore," Fletcher replied quietly. "And you have every right to cry. You lost everything today. I think you are entitled to fall apart a little." They finished their dinner with easier conversation after that. Fletcher told her about his ranch, how he had bought the land 5 years ago with money saved from working cattle drives, how he had built it up from nothing into a profitable operation running 500 head of cattle, and a string of horses he was beginning to breed for sale. Zelda told him about her parents, about the loneliness of the past 2 years living alone on her small homestead, about the garden she had loved, and the chickens she had named after characters from Shakespeare. "Ophelia, Desdemona, Juliet, Lady Macbeth, Portia, and Beatrice," she said, and felt fresh tears prick her eyes at the memory of those silly hens that had been her companions. "I know it was foolish to name chickens, but they had distinct personalities." "It is not foolish," Fletcher said firmly. "And for what it is worth, those are excellent names for chickens. Any chicken named Lady Macbeth had to be trouble." Despite everything, Zelda laughed. She was. She pecked the others and always got to the feed first and generally terrorized the coop, but she also laid the biggest eggs. Fletcher smiled, a real smile this time that reached his eyes and transformed his serious face. Sounds like she was aptly named then. That night, lying in the comfortable guest bed in a stranger's house wearing a dead woman's nightgown, Zelda stared at the ceiling and tried to figure out what to do with the rest of her life. She had no home to return to. Her $47 would not be enough to rebuild, not even close. She could try to find work in town, but positions for unmarried women were limited. Teaching, perhaps, if the school had survived the tornado and they needed another teacher. Seamstress work, laundry, cleaning. None of those options appealed, but survival rarely cared about appeal. She spent 3 days at the Emerson ranch, recovering from her injuries and the shock of the tornado. Fletcher was gone most of each day, working his ranch with the crew of 6 hands he employed, but he made a point of joining her for dinner each evening. Mrs. Chen fussed over Zelda like a mother hen, feeding her constantly and insisting she rest, and slowly Zelda began to feel human again. Her cuts healed, the bruises faded to yellow and green, and her mind began to clear enough to make plans. On the 4th morning, Fletcher found her on the porch, drinking coffee and watching the sunrise paint the desert in shades of gold and crimson. He poured himself a cup from the pot Mrs. Chen kept constantly brewing and settled into the chair beside her. "I have been thinking about your situation," he said without preamble, "and I have a proposition for you if you will hear me out." Zelda tensed. She had heard about propositions men made to women without prospects, and she had already decided she would rather starve than accept that kind of help. Fletcher must have seen something in her face because he held up a hand quickly. "Nothing improper, I swear. Just hear me out. I need to rebuild your house." Zelda blinked. "I am sorry, what? Your house. I want to rebuild it." "My ranch is doing well. I have the money and the materials and the men to do the work. Let me rebuild your place for you." He was turning his coffee cup in his hands, not quite meeting her eyes, and Zelda realized he was nervous. "Mr. Emerson, I cannot possibly accept such a gift. The cost would be enormous and I have no way to repay you. I do not want repayment." Now he did look at her, his green eyes intense. Call it neighborly assistance, call it Christian charity, call it whatever you want, but let me do this. You should not lose your home and your land because of an act of God. That is not right. It is too much, Zelda protested, even as part of her desperately wanted to say yes. Why would you do this for someone you barely know? Fletcher was quiet for a long moment, staring out at the desert. My father died when I was 16. A horse threw him and he broke his neck. We lost the ranch we were working on in Texas because my mother and I could not keep up with the mortgage payments without his income. We ended up in a tenement in Fort Worth, my mother taking in laundry and me working in a stockyard for pennies. She died of pneumonia 3 years later because we could not afford proper medicine or a decent place to live. His voice was flat, emotionless, but Zelda could hear the pain underneath. I swore then that if I ever had the means, I would never let anyone lose everything if I could prevent it. I have the means now. Let me do this. Zelda's throat was tight. That is a kind offer, Mr. Emerson, but I still cannot accept. It would not be proper, and it would put me in your debt in a way I could never repay. Then repay me by letting me hire you. Fletcher turned to face her fully. Mrs. Chen is getting older and this house is big. She could use help with the housework, the cooking, the garden she wants to start. Work for me for room and board plus a fair wage, and I will rebuild your house. When it is finished, you can decide if you want to move back or stay on here as my housekeeper. No debt, just honest work for honest pay. It was a logical solution, Zelda had to admit. She would earn her keep rather than accepting charity, and she would end up with a home again. But living and working on Fletcher Emerson's ranch, seeing him every day, felt dangerous in a way she could not quite articulate. There was something about him that made her pulse quicken, made her aware of herself in a way she had not been since Samuel Morgan had courted her briefly 3 years ago, before deciding she was too educated and independent for his taste. I need time to think about it, she said finally. Of course, take all the time you need. Fletcher stood, setting his empty cup on the porch rail. But Miss Patterson, for what it is worth, I think you would be doing me a favor as much as I would be helping you. This ranch is a lonely place and Mrs. Chen and I could use the company. He left her then, striding off toward the barn where his men were gathering for the day's work, and Zelda sat alone with her thoughts and the desert sunrise. The sensible thing to do was accept his offer. The proud thing was to refuse and make her own way, even if that meant scrubbing floors in town for barely enough money to rent a room. But when had pride ever kept anyone warm or fed? That evening, Zelda found Fletcher in the barn, grooming one of his horses with long, steady strokes. He looked up when she entered, and she saw hope flash across his face before he schooled it to neutrality. I accept your offer, she said without preamble. I will work as your housekeeper and you can rebuild my house. But I insist on a contract stating the terms clearly, and I want to help with the rebuilding when I can. It should be my hands in that house too, not just yours. Fletcher's face broke into a wide smile that made him look years younger. Done. I will draw up a contract tonight, and we can start on the house tomorrow if the weather holds. They shook hands on it, and Zelda felt the rough calluses on his palm, the strength in his grip, the warmth of his skin against hers. Something electric passed between them in that moment, something that made her pull her hand back quickly and step away, her heart hammering. Fletcher looked startled too, staring at his hand as if it had betrayed him. I should get back to the house, Zelda said quickly. Mrs. Chen will need help with dinner. She fled before he could respond, her face burning. This was a business arrangement, nothing more. She could not afford to complicate it with inappropriate feelings for her employer. But as she helped Mrs. Chen prepare the evening meal, She kept remembering the warmth of Fletcher's hand, and the way his smile had transformed his entire face. The next morning, Fletcher assembled his crew and a wagon full of supplies, and they all rode out to Zelda's property. In the clear light of day, with a week having passed since the tornado, the destruction looked different. Nature was already beginning to reclaim the space, weeds sprouting through the scattered debris. Fletcher walked the property with Zelda, discussing where the new house should sit, asking her opinions on layout and size. "Bigger than before," he said firmly when she protested his plans. "You need a proper house, Miss Patterson, not a one-room cabin. 2 bedrooms, a real kitchen, a sitting room. Something that will stand up to the next tornado and any other disaster this land wants to throw at it." "That will cost a fortune," Zelda protested. "Then it is fortunate I have a fortune to spend." Fletcher grinned at her. "Well, maybe not a fortune, but enough. Let me do this right, please. It will ease my conscience about every other person I could not help." How could she argue with that? So she nodded and watched as Fletcher and his men began the work of clearing the site and preparing the foundation. True to her word, Zelda helped where she could, hauling debris, sorting through the scattered remains of her old life for anything salvageable, bringing water and food to the workers. The physical labor was exhausting but also therapeutic, giving her a sense of purpose and control she had lost when the tornado tore through her life. Fletcher was a revelation to watch. He worked alongside his men, never asking them to do anything he would not do himself, swinging a sledgehammer to break up the old foundation, digging post holes, sawing lumber. He stripped down to his shirt sleeves in the heat, sweat soaking through the fabric, his muscles moving beneath the thin cotton. Zelda tried not to stare, but it was difficult. There was something compelling about watching a strong man engaged in hard physical work, something primal that made her mouth go dry. Mrs. Chen noticed, of course. The older woman noticed everything. One afternoon, as they were preparing dinner back at the ranch house, she gave Zelda a knowing look. "Fletcher is a good man," she said casually, too casually. "He works hard, treats people fair, does not drink or gamble. Any woman would be lucky to have him." Zelda felt her face heat. "I am sure you are right, but I am just his employee, Mrs. Chen. Nothing more. MMM." Mrs. Chen did not sound convinced. "You look at him like he is water and you are dying of thirst. He looks at you the same way. You think old Chen does not see, but Chen sees everything." "There is nothing to see," Zelda insisted, but her protest sounded weak even to her own ears. "Mrs. Chen just laughed and returned to chopping vegetables, and Zelda focused determinedly on kneading the bread dough, trying not to think about Fletcher's smile or the way her heart stuttered when he looked at her. The house took shape slowly over the following weeks. Fletcher had not been exaggerating when he said he wanted to build it to last. The foundation was stone and mortar, deep and solid. The frame was thick timbers that would withstand wind and weather. He showed Zelda his plans one evening, spreading the drawings across the dining room table, and she was overwhelmed by the care he had put into every detail. "Storm shutters for every window," he explained, pointing. "Reinforced roof with extra bracing. Stone fireplace here, built right into the structure for stability. Root cellar under the kitchen for storage and shelter if another tornado comes through. You will be safe here, Miss Patterson. I swear it." "You are building me a fortress," Zelda said softly, running her fingers over the drawings. "Why?" Fletcher was quiet for a moment. "Because you deserve to feel safe. Because everyone deserves a home that will protect them. Because I can, and so I should." Their eyes met across the table, and Zelda felt that electric current again, stronger this time. Fletcher reached across the table and covered her hand with his, and neither of them moved. They stayed like that for a long moment, the only sound Mrs. Chen humming in the kitchen, until Fletcher cleared his throat and pulled his hand back. "I should turn in," he said, his voice rougher than usual. "Early start tomorrow." Zelda nodded, not trusting her voice, and watched him go. Her hand was still warm where he had touched her. The days fell into a rhythm after that. Zelda rose early to help Mrs. Chen with breakfast, then rode out to the building site with Fletcher and his crew. She worked alongside them until midday, then returned to the ranch house to help prepare the noon meal and tackle the household chores. Evenings were spent in Fletcher's company, sometimes in comfortable silence, sometimes in conversation that ranged from philosophy to ranch management to memories of their respective childhoods. Zelda learned that Fletcher loved poetry, but was too embarrassed to admit it to his ranch hands. Fletcher learned that Zelda had taught herself to read Greek and Latin from her father's old books. They discovered they both loved thunderstorms, hated oysters, and believed that people were fundamentally good even when evidence suggested otherwise. They were becoming friends, Zelda realized. Real friends, the kind who knew each other's thoughts and could communicate with a glance. It was dangerous, because she was also becoming increasingly attracted to him, increasingly aware of the way her body responded when he was near, the way her thoughts drifted to him during the day, the way she looked forward to their evening conversations with an intensity that scared her. Mrs. Chen continued to make knowing comments, and Fletcher's ranch hands began giving Zelda speculative looks that made her uncomfortable. Even the horses seemed to sense something, the way Fletcher's big bay gelding would nicker softly whenever she approached, as if welcoming her to the family. 6 weeks after the tornado, the frame of Zelda's new house was complete, and Fletcher insisted on a celebration. He had Mrs. Chen prepare a feast, invited his ranch hands to join them, and they all ate together under the stars, sitting on the porch of the unfinished house. Someone produced a fiddle, and there was music and laughter, and Zelda felt something loosen in her chest that had been tight since the morning she woke to find her world destroyed. Fletcher found her later, standing in what would be her bedroom, looking out the window opening at the desert under moonlight. "What are you thinking?" he asked softly. "That I thought my life was over when the tornado came through," Zelda said honestly. "That I could not imagine how I would survive losing everything. But standing here in this house that you built for me, I realize I did not lose everything. I lost things, possessions, walls and roof, but I am still here, and somehow, impossibly, I am happy." "I am glad," Fletcher said, and there was something in his voice that made Zelda turn to look at him. He was backlit by moonlight, his face in shadow, but she could feel the intensity of his gaze. "I need to tell you something, Miss Patterson. Zelda. I need to tell you that this has not been charity or neighborly assistance or Christian duty. I rebuilt your house because I could not stand the thought of you leaving. Because somewhere in the past 6 weeks, you have become essential to my happiness in a way I did not think possible." Zelda's breath caught. "Fletcher, I am in love with you," he continued, the words tumbling out as if he had been holding them back too long. "I know that is inappropriate. I know you are my employee and under my protection, and I should not be saying any of this, but I cannot keep it to myself anymore. You do not have to feel the same way. You do not have to do anything about it, but I needed you to know." Zelda crossed the empty room in 3 strides and kissed him. It was impulsive and improper, and she did not care. Fletcher made a surprised sound against her mouth, and then his arms came around her, pulling her close, and the kiss deepened into something that made the rest of the world disappear. When they finally broke apart, both breathing hard, Zelda pressed her forehead to his. "I love you too," she whispered. I have been trying not to because it seemed impossible, but I do. I love you, Fletcher Emerson." His laugh was shaky with relief. "Thank God. I have been half crazy trying to figure out if you felt the same way or if I was imagining things." "Mrs. Chen knew," Zelda said, starting to laugh herself. "She told me weeks ago that we looked at each other like we were dying of thirst. Mrs. Chen is a wise woman." Fletcher cupped her face in his hands, his thumbs stroking her cheekbones. "Marry me, Zelda. I know it is fast. I know we have only known each other 6 weeks, but marry me anyway. Let me spend the rest of my life making you happy." "Yes," Zelda said without hesitation. "Yes, I will marry you." They kissed again, slower this time, learning the shape and taste of each other, and Zelda felt like she was flying. The tornado had taken her house but spared her life, and that life had led her here to this man, to this moment, to this second chance at happiness she had never expected. They told Mrs. Chen the next morning, and the older woman's response was to clap her hands and announce she had known it would happen since the day Fletcher brought Zelda home. They told the ranch hands, who congratulated Fletcher with much back-slapping and ribald jokes that made Zelda blush. They rode into Las Vegas to speak with Reverend Thomas, who had been conducting services in the schoolhouse since the Methodist church was destroyed, and set a wedding date for 3 weeks hence, enough time for the banns to be read and for Zelda to prepare. The town had recovered remarkably well from the tornado. Most of the damaged buildings had been repaired or rebuilt, and life had returned to something approaching normal. Zelda had worried that people would gossip about her quick engagement to Fletcher, but instead, everyone seemed genuinely happy for them. The tornado had reminded everyone how short and uncertain life was, and no one wanted to waste time on petty judgment. Zelda spent those 3 weeks in a whirlwind of preparation. Mrs. Chen helped her make a wedding dress from ivory silk that Fletcher purchased in town, insisting it was his wedding gift to her. The ranch hands finished the exterior of her new house, completing the roof and hanging the door and installing the storm shutters, though the interior was still unfinished. Fletcher worked from dawn to dusk to ensure everything was perfect, his excitement palpable. They took care to observe propriety during the engagement, always having Mrs. Chen as a chaperone, never spending time alone behind closed doors. But they stole kisses in the barn and held hands under the table at dinner, and talked late into the night on the porch, planning their future together. Fletcher wanted children, at least 3 or 4, and a bigger horse breeding operation. Zelda wanted to teach the children of ranch families in the area to start a small school. They would build their life together, blending dreams and ambitions into something stronger than either could create alone. The night before the wedding, Zelda stayed in her new house for the first time, accompanied by Mrs. Chen for propriety's sake. They spread bedrolls on the floor of the main bedroom since there was no furniture yet and lay in the darkness talking. "Are you nervous?" Mrs. Chen asked. "No," Zelda said, surprising herself with the truth of it. "I thought I would be, but I am not. Fletcher is a good man and I love him. Everything else we will figure out together." "You are wise for one so young," Mrs. Chen said approvingly. "Fletcher is lucky to have you. You are lucky to have each other." The wedding took place on a brilliant August afternoon, the sky so blue it hurt to look at. Zelda wore her ivory silk dress with wildflowers in her hair, and Fletcher wore a new suit he had purchased specially for the occasion. The ceremony was held in the schoolhouse, packed with townspeople and neighboring ranchers who had come to witness the union. Zelda had no family to give her away, so she walked the aisle alone, her head held high, her eyes locked on Fletcher waiting for her at the front of the room. Reverend Thomas performed the ceremony with warmth and humor, speaking about love and commitment and the way hardship could bring people together rather than tear them apart. When he asked Fletcher to state his vows, the cowboy's voice was clear and steady. "I, Fletcher Emerson, take you, Zelda Patterson, to be my lawfully wedded wife. I promise to love you, honor you, and cherish you for all the days of my life. I promise to be your shelter in every storm, your comfort in every sorrow, and your partner in every joy. I will build a life with you that is strong enough to withstand anything this world throws at us." Zelda's voice trembled slightly, but did not break when she spoke her own vows. "I, Zelda Patterson, take you, Fletcher Emerson, to be my lawfully wedded husband. I promise to love you, honor you, and cherish you for all the days of my life. I promise to be your companion in all things, to stand beside you in hardship and happiness alike, to build a life and a home with you that will stand the test of time." Reverend Thomas pronounced them husband and wife, and Fletcher kissed her to enthusiastic applause from the assembled crowd. They walked back down the aisle together, hand in hand, and Zelda felt like she was glowing from the inside out. The reception was held at the Emerson Ranch, which was now also the Patterson Ranch, Zelda realized with a start of joy. Fletcher's men had strung lanterns around the yard, and there was music and dancing and more food than Zelda had seen since before her parents died. She danced with Fletcher, with his ranch hands, with Dr. Morrison and Reverend Thomas and half the men in town. But it was Fletcher she kept returning to, Fletcher whose hand she sought in the crowd, Fletcher whose eyes followed her wherever she went. As the sun set and the lanterns glowed brighter, Fletcher pulled her aside away from the noise and crowd. "Ready to see your wedding present?" he asked, his eyes sparkling with mischief. "You already gave me a wedding present," Zelda protested. "You built me an entire house." "That was not a wedding present, that was a basic act of human decency," Fletcher said firmly. "This is different. Come on." He led her to the new house, and Zelda gasped when she stepped inside. The last time she had been here, 2 days ago, the interior had been bare studs and raw flooring. Now it was completely finished. The walls were smooth plaster, painted a soft cream. The floors were polished pine, covered with beautiful woven rugs. The front room held a sofa and chairs arranged around a stone fireplace. The kitchen had a new stove, a table and chairs, cabinets stocked with dishes and cooking supplies. In the bedroom, a 4-poster bed with a beautiful quilt stood against one wall, flanked by matching nightstands. Everything was perfect, everything was beautiful, and Zelda could not speak past the lump in her throat. "How?" she finally managed. "Mrs. Chen and the boys helped," Fletcher said, looking pleased with himself. "We have been working on it every spare moment for the past week. Do you like it?" "Like it, Fletcher, it is perfect. It is more than I ever dreamed of having." She turned to him, tears streaming down her face. "How did I get so lucky? How did I survive that tornado only to find you?" Fletcher pulled her into his arms, holding her close. "I ask myself the same thing every day. I was just a lonely rancher before you, Zelda. Now I have a wife, a partner, a future worth building. You gave me that." They kissed, and this time there was no need to pull away, no chaperone to consider, no propriety to observe. They were married now, bound together legally and spiritually, and this house that Fletcher had built was their home. When the kiss ended, Fletcher swept Zelda into his arms and carried her across the threshold properly, making her laugh, and then they were alone together for the first time as husband and wife. The wedding guests eventually dispersed, returning to their own homes, and the ranch settled into quiet. Fletcher and Zelda spent their wedding night in their new house, learning each other in the way of newlyweds, and Zelda marveled at how her life had transformed. 3 months ago, she had been alone, scraping by on her small homestead with no prospects and no future. Now she was married to a man she loved desperately, living in a beautiful home, surrounded by people who cared for her. It was more than she had dared to hope for. The months that followed were the happiest of Zelda's life. She and Fletcher settled into married life with surprising ease, their friendship and mutual respect forming a foundation that made the adjustment smooth. They divided their time between the ranch house, where Fletcher conducted his business, and the new house that was slowly becoming filled with their shared possessions and memories. Mrs. Chen continued to live and work at the main ranch house, but she welcomed Zelda's help and treated her more like a daughter than an employee. Fletcher was attentive and affectionate, never missing an opportunity to show Zelda how much he loved her. He brought her wildflowers for no reason, kissed her goodbye every morning, and made time for her even during the busiest days. Zelda threw herself into ranch life, learning to manage the household accounts, helping with the horses Fletcher was breeding, even learning to rope cattle despite Fletcher's initial protests that it was too dangerous. "I am a rancher's wife," she told him firmly. "I should know how to do ranch work." "You are going to be the death of me," Fletcher muttered, but he taught her anyway, and Zelda discovered she had a knack for it. By November, Zelda suspected she was pregnant. She waited until she was certain before telling Fletcher, choosing a quiet evening when they were alone in their house, the fire crackling in the hearth, rain pattering on the roof they both trusted to keep them safe. "I have news," she said, settling onto the sofa beside him. "We are going to have a baby. Sometime in late spring, I think." Fletcher's face cycled through shock, disbelief, and pure joy in the space of seconds. Then he was kissing her, laughing, pulling her into his lap, his hands cradling her still flat stomach with such tenderness it made Zelda's heart ache. "A baby," he kept repeating. "We are going to have a baby. Zelda, you have made me the happiest man alive." The pregnancy was relatively easy, and Zelda continued to work on the ranch through the winter months, only slowing down as she grew larger and more ungainly. Fletcher became hilariously overprotective, trying to prevent her from doing anything more strenuous than sitting still, until Zelda firmly told him that she was pregnant, not fragile, and he needed to stop treating her like glass. Their son was born on a warm May evening in 1884, almost exactly a year after the tornado that had changed Zelda's life. Dr. Morrison attended the birth, assisted by Mrs. Chen, while Fletcher paced the floor of the main house and drove everyone crazy with his worry. When Mrs. Chen finally emerged to tell him he had a son and both mother and baby were healthy, Fletcher nearly knocked her down in his rush to get to Zelda's side. Zelda was exhausted but radiant, cradling the tiny, red-faced infant in her arms. Fletcher knelt beside the bed, staring at his son with an expression of awe that made Zelda fall in love with him all over again. "He is perfect," Fletcher whispered, touching one tiny fist with a gentle finger. "What should we name him?" They had discussed names throughout the pregnancy but had not reached a firm decision. Now, looking at her husband's face, Zelda knew exactly what she wanted. "Francis," she said. "Francis Theodore Emerson, after your father and mine." Fletcher's eyes went bright with unshed tears. "Are you sure?" "I am certain. They would both be proud to have this boy carry their names." Francis Theodore Emerson proved to be a healthy, hungry baby with a set of lungs that could wake the entire ranch. Fletcher was a devoted father, getting up for nighttime feedings despite Zelda's protests, changing diapers without complaint, spending hours just holding his son and marveling at the miracle they had created. Zelda watched him with their baby and felt her heart expand in ways she had not known were possible. Life settled into a new rhythm with a child in the house. The ranch continued to prosper, Fletcher's horse breeding program gaining a reputation for quality animals that commanded good prices. Zelda started her school as she had dreamed, teaching the children of neighboring ranches 3 days a week in the front room of their house. She loved the work, loved shaping young minds, and was good at it. Francis grew into a sturdy toddler with his father's green eyes and his mother's dark hair, fearless and curious, and constantly getting into trouble. He learned to ride almost before he could walk properly, perched in front of Fletcher on the big bay gelding, laughing with delight at the movement. He followed the ranch hands around, imitating their work with his own child-sized tools, and already showed signs of inheriting his parents' stubbornness. When Francis was 2, Zelda became pregnant again. This pregnancy was harder than the first, marked by fatigue and sickness that lasted well into the second trimester. Fletcher worried, but Dr. Morrison assured them that everything was progressing normally, just differently than before. Their daughter was born in December 1886, during the first snowfall of the season, and they named her Margaret Rose, after Fletcher's mother. Margaret was a quieter baby than Francis had been, content to observe the world with solemn dark eyes that seemed too wise for an infant. She had Zelda's features and Fletcher's coloring, a beautiful combination that made strangers stop to admire her. Francis was initially suspicious of this new person who had invaded his domain, but he quickly became protective of his baby sister, insisting on helping with everything related to her care. The years passed in a blur of joy and hard work and love. Fletcher's ranch became one of the most successful in the territory, his reputation for fair dealing and quality stock spreading far beyond Las Vegas. Zelda's school grew, eventually requiring her to take on an assistant teacher to handle the enrollment. They added rooms onto their house as their family grew, including a third child, a son they named Samuel John, born in 1889. Through it all, Zelda never forgot the tornado that had brought her to this life. Every May 15th, on the anniversary of that terrible morning, she walked out to the place where her original cabin had stood and said a prayer of thanksgiving. Fletcher always went with her, holding her hand, and they would stand together in silence, remembering the destruction and celebrating the life they had built from the ashes. "You ever regret it?" Fletcher asked one year as they stood on the windswept plain. "Losing your parents' home, everything they built?" Zelda considered the question seriously before answering. "I regret that I lost the physical pieces of them, the things they touched and made, but their real legacy was not a building, Fletcher. It was the values they taught me, the strength they gave me, the love they showed me. That survived the tornado, and I carry it with me every day. And in a strange way, losing that house brought me to you, brought me to this life. How can I regret something that led to so much happiness?" Fletcher pulled her close, kissing her temple. "I love you, Zelda Emerson, more today than yesterday, less than tomorrow." "Poet," she teased, but her voice was thick with emotion. They raised their children with love and high expectations, teaching them to work hard, treat others with respect, and stand up for what was right. Francis grew into a tall, serious young man who loved the ranch and showed every sign of being able to run it himself someday. Margaret was brilliant, with a mind that devoured books and ideas, already talking about becoming a doctor despite the raised eyebrows that ambition provoked. Samuel was the family comedian, charming and mischievous, able to talk his way out of almost any trouble. Fletcher and Zelda watched their children grow with pride and occasional terror at how quickly time was passing. They were no longer young themselves, both approaching 40, their hair showing touches of gray, their faces lined from years of sun and wind and laughter. But their love had not diminished. If anything, it had deepened, matured into something richer and more complex than the initial passion they had felt as newlyweds. They still made time for each other, still stole moments alone despite the demands of children and ranch and school. They still held hands across the dinner table, still kissed like newlyweds when they thought no one was watching, still talked late into the night about dreams and fears and the future. Mrs. Chen grew old with them, her hair pure white now, her movements slower, but her mind still sharp and her tongue still quick. She was grandmother to their children in all but blood, and when she died peacefully in her sleep in 1895, they mourned her as family. She was buried on a hill overlooking the ranch, and Zelda made sure her grave was always decorated with fresh flowers. Nevada was changing around them. The wild, lawless frontier of Fletcher's youth was becoming civilized, tamed by law and railroad and telegraph. Las Vegas grew from a rough outpost into a proper town with brick buildings and paved streets, and even electric lights in the commercial district. The ranch had to adapt to changing markets and new technologies, but Fletcher proved as adept at navigating these changes as he had been at building his operation from nothing. Frances married in 1905, wedding a school teacher named Elizabeth from California, and they built a house on ranch land just over the hill from Fletcher and Zelda's home. Margaret defied convention and family pressure to attend medical college in San Francisco, eventually becoming one of the first female doctors in Nevada. Samuel tried his hand at various enterprises, from prospecting to theater promotion, before finally settling down to breed horses on a section of the ranch Fletcher gifted him. Fletcher and Zelda became grandparents, delighting in the babies that Frances and Elizabeth produced with regularity. They watched their children build their own lives while remaining connected to the ranch and the family. They faced hardships too, droughts and disease and the death of friends, but they faced everything together, their partnership unshakable after so many years. On their 20th wedding anniversary in 1903, Fletcher surprised Zelda by taking her on a trip to San Francisco, leaving the ranch in Frances's capable hands. They stayed in a fancy hotel, ate in restaurants, went to the theater, and explored the city like young lovers on a honeymoon. One evening, as they walked along the waterfront watching the sun set over the bay, Zelda stopped and turned to face her husband. "You remember what you said to me the night you proposed, that you would spend the rest of your life making me happy." "I remember," Fletcher said, smiling at the memory. "Have I succeeded? Beyond my wildest dreams," Zelda said seriously. "I want you to know that, Fletcher. I want you to know that marrying you was the best decision I ever made, that loving you has been the greatest joy of my life, that if I could go back and change anything about that terrible morning when the tornado came, I would not, because it brought me to you." Fletcher's eyes were suspiciously bright. "The tornado took your house but spared your life, and you took that life and made it something beautiful. We made it something beautiful together, and I would go through 100 tornadoes if it meant ending up here with you." They kissed as the sun sank below the horizon, painting the sky in shades of crimson and gold. Two people who had found each other in the aftermath of disaster and built something stronger than any storm could destroy. The years continued their relentless march. Fletcher's hair went white, though he remained strong and active well into his 60s. Zelda's dark hair silvered gracefully, and her hands developed arthritis that made teaching difficult, though she refused to fully retire until 1912, when she was 60, and decided she had earned the right to rest. They spent their later years quietly, tending their garden, spoiling their grandchildren, sitting on the porch of the house Fletcher had built so many years ago and watching the desert sunset. The house had stood for over 30 years now, weathering storms and heat and time, solid and strong just as Fletcher had promised it would be. Fletcher died peacefully in 1917 at the age of 62, sitting in his favorite chair on the porch with Zelda beside him. One moment he was there, commenting on the beauty of the evening sky, and the next he was gone, slipping away as gently as a sigh. Zelda held his hand and wept, even as she thanked God for the decades they had been given together. She lived another 8 years without him, surrounded by children and grandchildren and even great-grandchildren, her house always full of life and laughter. But she missed Fletcher every single day, missed his smile and his strength and the way he had always made her feel safe and cherished. Zelda died on May 15, 1925, exactly 42 years after the tornado that had destroyed her life and led her to Fletcher. She died in the house he had built for her, in the bed they had shared for so many years, surrounded by everyone she loved. Her last words were of Fletcher, saying she would see him soon, and her children liked to believe she was right. They buried her next to her husband on the hill overlooking the ranch, the house Fletcher had built standing strong in the valley below. The stone marker read, Zelda Patterson Emerson, 1860–1925. Beloved wife, mother, grandmother, teacher. She survived the storm and built a life of love. The house remained in the family for generations, each adding their own touches, but preserving the essential structure that Fletcher had designed to withstand any disaster. It became a symbol for the family, a reminder that destruction could lead to creation, that loss could lead to love, that the strongest foundations were built not of stone and timber, but of love and commitment, and the determination to rebuild no matter what storms life brought. And whenever the wind howled and the sky turned dark, the descendants of Fletcher and Zelda would look at that house and remember the story. The story of a tornado that took everything but life, and a cowboy who built something stronger from the ruins. The story of two people who found each other in the aftermath of disaster and loved each other through triumph and hardship until death finally parted them. The story of a love that was, itself, strong enough to withstand any storm.